You ever smell fresh asphalt mixed with cattle manure at 6 in the morning? That's the scent of a mistake worth about $15 million. The engine noise hit me before I even stepped out of my truck, a low grinding roar rolling across my pasture like a storm that didn't belong there. And when I opened the door, the air felt wrong, thick with heat, diesel fumes, and something sharp that didn't belong anywhere near livestock. I could hear the crunch of gravel under heavy tires, the metallic clank of equipment, and then I saw it, a clean, pale strip of concrete cutting straight through the middle of my grazing land like someone had taken a ruler and decided nature needed correcting. My fence line was gone, posts pulled clean out of the ground, barbed wire coiled like it had been ripped up in a hurry, and beyond it, men in neon vests were pouring a bike path right through a field that held over 40 head of active cattle, animals that weighed close to 2,000 pounds each and didn't care about zoning maps or HOA newsletters. I stood there for a second, just listening, the hum of machinery, the distant lowing of my herd, the soft hiss of wet concrete settling into place, and then a voice cut through it, sharp, polished, practiced. "Ethan, you're going to love this upgrade." And I didn't even have to turn to know it was Brenda Collins, HOA president, walking across my land like she owned every inch of it, her shoes sinking slightly into the dirt, but her smile never slipping, like this was a ribbon cutting instead of a trespass. I glanced down at the survey stake near my boot, still marked with my family's boundary line from 3 generations back, then back at the path, already stretching nearly a quarter-mile across my pasture, smooth, deliberate, permanent. "You built this here?" I asked, keeping my voice level, and she gave a little laugh, the kind that always sounded like it came with paperwork. "It's a community improvement. Residents have been complaining about the smell, the noise, the aesthetic." She waved a hand toward my cattle like they were the problem, like they hadn't been here decades before her HOA ever existed. The wind shifted and carried the scent of manure and warm grass across the new concrete, and I watched one of my steers lift its head, ears twitching, confused by the noise and the strangers inside its space. "You didn't think to ask," I said, and she tilted her head, almost sympathetic. "Oh, we have permits, Ethan. Everything's been approved at the county level." She said it slow, like she was explaining something simple to someone who wouldn't understand anyway, and I just nodded, letting my eyes move past her to the line of freshly poured concrete, still curing under the rising sun, already marked with neat white edges for bicycles that hadn't even arrived yet. And that's when I noticed the small sign they'd planted near the edge, bright and cheerful. "Willow Creek Community Bike Path. Grand opening this Saturday." And I could almost hear the future in that moment. The soft whir of tires, the laughter, the lawsuits, the insurance adjusters, the quiet collapse of something they thought was untouchable. I took a slow breath, tasting asphalt and dust, and said the only thing that made sense. "You might want to move that opening date." Brenda smiled wider, like she'd already won. "Don't worry, Ethan, we've handled everything." And I looked out over my pasture, at the herd shifting uneasily near the edge of that brand new path, at the broken fence, at the concrete slicing through land that was never meant to be shared, and I just nodded again. Because she was right about one thing. Everything had already been set in motion. They just didn't realize yet who actually controlled how it ended. I did not raise my voice, and that was the first thing that confused her, because people like Brenda expected resistance to sound loud, messy, emotional, something they could document and dismiss. But I just stood there with my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground and watched her workers finish smoothing out a section of concrete that cut straight across my north grazing line, the same stretch where my cattle moved every morning between water and shade. And I could already see the problem forming in real time, not as an argument, but as a chain reaction, the kind that starts small and ends with numbers nobody wants to say out loud. "You said county approved this?" I asked, keeping my tone flat, and she nodded immediately, pulling out a folded packet like she had been waiting for that moment. Crisp papers, stamped seals, signatures that looked official enough to make most people step back. "Zoning variance, community improvement grant, full compliance," she said, tapping each page with a manicured finger. And I took it without rushing, letting the paper sit in my hand while the smell of curing asphalt thickened under the rising heat, mixing with hay and manure until it created something almost metallic in the back of my throat. I glanced at the header, then at the parcel number, and that was when I saw it. The first crack in something they thought was airtight. The number was close, but not exact, off by just enough to belong to the neighboring undeveloped strip that had been tied up in a land trust for years. Not this pasture, not my pasture. I looked up at her and she was still smiling, confident, already picturing ribbon cuttings and weekend cyclists. And for a second, I almost said something, almost pointed it out, almost saved her from what was coming. But then one of my steers let out a low, uneasy call, pacing near the edge of the fresh concrete, confused by the noise and the scent and the absence of the fence that used to guide him. And I remembered the letter she had sent 2 weeks ago about odor complaints and property value concerns, like my land was an inconvenience instead of the reason this entire area existed in the first place. So I handed the papers back without a word. Everything looks good then, I said, and that was the moment she relaxed completely, shoulders dropping, victory settling in, because in her mind, silence meant surrender. She gave a satisfied nod and turned back toward her crew, calling out instructions about signage placement and final inspections. Already moving on like this was done, finished, irreversible, and I walked the length of that new path slowly, boots thudding softly against sections that had already set, feeling the temperature difference between sun-baked concrete and the cooler patches still. Hearing, counting distance out of habit, 100 yards, 200, nearly a quarter-mile slicing through active livestock land that was never zoned, never insured, never designed for public access. And with every step I could see the layers stacking up: liability, trespass, agricultural disruption, safety compliance, environmental impact, each one small on its own, but together they were something else entirely, something exponential. I stopped near the far end where the path curved slightly toward the creek, and I could hear water moving under the brush, steady, controlled, managed, because that creek was not natural anymore, not for a long time. I crouched down and ran my hand along the edge of the concrete, still damp, still soft enough to take an impression, and I pressed my thumb into it just enough to leave a mark that would harden by the afternoon. A small detail, something most people would never notice. But I knew exactly where it was and what it meant. I stood back up and looked out over the land, my land, the cattle shifting, the machines idling down, the path gleaming under the sun like a scar that had not decided what it wanted to become yet. And I pulled my phone out, not to call a lawyer, not yet, but to open an app that tracked something far more important than permits, something tied to every drop of water that moved through this property and every legal agreement that governed it. And as the screen lit up, reflecting the bright white of that brand new bike path, I could not help but smile just a little, because they thought they had built a shortcut through my pasture. But what they actually built was a trigger, and they had no idea how far the consequences were about to spread. I did not call anyone that morning, not the county, not a lawyer, not even my ranch manager, because timing is everything when you are about to let someone's mistake grow into something irreversible. And what they had done was not just pour concrete. They had altered a system they did not even know existed. I leaned against my truck and watched as the crew packed up, the last machine rolling off my land while the path sat there curing under a sky that was getting hotter by the minute. And I could hear my cattle shifting again, restless, confused by the missing fence line, the new smell, the foreign shape cutting through their routine. One of the younger steers stepped closer, sniffing at the edge of the concrete before backing off, uneasy, and that was when I checked the time, 9:12 in the morning, which meant upstream release would hit in about 3 hours if everything stayed on schedule. I opened the app again and scrolled through a dashboard that most people would not understand even if they were staring at it. Flow rates, pressure readings, scheduled distribution, all tied to a network of controlled irrigation channels and retention basins that fed not just my land, but half the properties surrounding it, including every manicured lawn that HOA liked to show off in their newsletters, and the path they had just built. It crossed directly over one of the primary lateral lines that regulated overflow during peak heat cycles, a system designed decades ago and quietly expanded over time. And I knew exactly what would happen if pressure built with no proper reinforcement above it. Not an explosion, nothing dramatic like that, just slow, relentless saturation, water finding its way up through soil that had been compacted differently beneath fresh concrete, undermining it from below until it started to shift, buckle, and fail in sections. I slid my phone back into my pocket and walked toward the creek where the path curved, listening to the steady movement of water beneath the surface, controlled for now, predictable, but that would not last long, because summer scheduling did not care about HOA projects or community upgrades. It followed temperature, evaporation rates, agricultural demand, and today was already pushing 90 degrees before noon, which meant increased flow was already cued. I knelt down again near the edge where I had pressed my thumb earlier and felt the concrete, firmer now, locking in shape, locking in a mistake that was about to cost someone far more than they ever budgeted. And behind me, I heard tires on gravel, slow, cautious, and I turned to see Brenda's SUV pulling up again. She stepped out, sunglasses on this time, posture relaxed, like she was just checking progress. "I figured you would come around," she said, walking toward me with that same controlled confidence. Change is always hard at first. I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, and gestured toward the path. "You ever check what runs under your projects?" I asked, and she frowned slightly, just enough to show irritation. "We followed every requirement," she replied, sharper now, and I nodded. "I believe you," I said, because she probably had, just not the right ones. She crossed her arms, glancing at the pasture, at the cattle, at the path. "Look, Ethan, this is happening. The grand opening is set. The community is excited. There is no reason to keep pushing back on something that benefits everyone." And that word everyone hung there for a second, like it included me when it clearly did not. I looked past her toward the far end of the property where the ground dipped slightly, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. And I could almost see the future already, the first soft spots forming, the subtle cracks, the calls, the confusion, the blame shifting, the insurance claims, the emergency meetings, all triggered by something as simple as ignoring what lay beneath the surface. "You are right," I said quietly, and she relaxed again, thinking she had won this twice now. "It is already happening," and I meant it in a way she would not understand until it was far too late, because what she saw as a finished project was, in reality, just the beginning of a process that had been set in motion long before her first permit was ever signed. By early afternoon, the heat had settled in hard, the kind that makes the air shimmer just above the ground, and I could feel it radiating off the new concrete as I walked back toward the house, each step carrying that faint hollow echo that did not belong in a pasture. Behind me, the herd had shifted again, tighter now, uneasy, instinctively avoiding the strip that cut through what used to be open movement. And that was exactly when the first notification came through, a soft vibration in my pocket, almost polite, like it was asking permission to ruin someone's week. I pulled out my phone and saw the numbers change in real time, flow rate increasing upstream, gates adjusting automatically, the system doing what it had always done, delivering water where it was scheduled to go. Except now, there was something new sitting right on top of a line that was never meant to carry static weight like that. I turned slowly and looked back across the pasture, the path stretching clean and bright under the sun, and for a second nothing seemed different. No cracks, no movement, just silence and heat. And then I saw it. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle darkening along one edge near the lowest point of the land, like the ground itself was exhaling moisture it had been holding back. I walked toward it, boots pressing into soil that felt just slightly softer than it should have, and crouched down, running my fingers along the edge where concrete met dirt, and there it was, a thin line of dampness pushing up from below, not enough for anyone to panic, not yet, but enough for me to know the timeline had just shortened. I stood up and looked toward the road as another vehicle approached, slower this time, cautious, and when it stopped I saw Brenda step out again. But this time she was not smiling. Her eyes went straight to the darkened section like she had already been told something was off. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sharper than before. And I did not answer right away. I just let the moment stretch. While another notification buzzed quietly in my hand, pressure stabilizing, flow continuing, everything exactly as designed, probably nothing. I said finally, keeping my tone neutral, and she walked closer, heels sinking slightly into the softer ground, her posture tightening as she looked down at the spreading patch. "This was poured this morning. It should not be doing that," she said, more to herself than to me, and I nodded once. "Concrete is only as stable as what is underneath it," I replied, and she straightened up quickly, defensive now, We had inspections, she snapped, and I met her gaze, calm, steady. On the wrong parcel, I said, and that was the first time her expression actually broke. Just for a second, confusion pushing through confidence. What are you talking about? She asked, and I reached into my truck, pulling out the original survey map, older paper, worn edges, lines drawn long before her HOA ever filed its first complaint. I laid it across the hood and pointed to the boundary markers, the real ones, the ones that mattered. You built about 30 feet off your approved line, I said, and she leaned in, eyes scanning, lips tightening as the realization started to form. Not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle her. That does not explain this, she said quickly, gesturing back at the damp concrete, and I followed her hand with my eyes, watching as the dark patch had spread just a little more, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. No, I said quietly. That is something else entirely, and right on cue, as if the land itself had been waiting for her to say it out loud. A faint, almost imperceptible shift ran along a section of the path, not a crack, not a break, just a slight unevenness, a ripple under the surface that should have been perfectly still. She saw it too. I could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her breath caught just a little. We need to call someone, she said, already reaching for her phone, and I stepped back, giving her space, because this was no longer about stopping anything. This was about letting it unfold, layer by layer, consequence by consequence. And as she dialed, voice rising, explaining, demanding answers, I looked out over the rest of the property, at the cattle, at the creek, at the path that was no longer just a path. And I knew this was the moment everything started to tip, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that would keep building until there was no easy fix left, and the cost of that small decision, that one complaint about smell and aesthetics, would begin to multiply into something far beyond what anyone in that HOA had ever budgeted for. The call she made did not take long to come back to her, and I could tell before she even spoke again that the answer was not what she expected. Her voice dropped lower, tighter, like she was trying to keep control of something that was already slipping. They are saying there is no record of an inspection for this exact parcel, she said, turning toward me with that same disbelief people get when paperwork fails them for the first time, and I just nodded slowly, letting her process it while the ground beneath us continued its quiet shift, the damp edge now spreading another inch, maybe two, subtle but steady, like a clock you could not hear unless you were paying attention. That is because they inspected the adjacent lot, I replied, keeping my tone calm, almost casual, and she shook her head immediately. That does not make sense. The contractor followed the plan, she insisted, and I let out a slow breath, glancing back at the line of concrete that now carried a faint, uneven sheen where moisture was working its way upward. Plans only work when they match reality, I said, and that was when the second call came in on her phone. This one louder, more urgent. I could hear a man's voice through the speaker, something about structural concerns, about needing to halt any further work, about liability exposure if conditions worsened, and she stepped away from me, pacing slightly, heels pressing deeper into soil that was no longer as firm as it had been that morning. No, we already scheduled the opening. People are expecting this, she said, frustration creeping in, but expectation does not change physics. And as she argued, I turned my attention back to the pasture, watching how my cattle had moved even farther away from the path, instinctively creating distance from something they did not trust. And that instinct was something I had learned to respect over the years, because animals notice shifts long before people do. I walked a few steps along the path again, feeling a slight give under one section that had been solid just hours before, not enough to alarm anyone casually walking across it, but enough for me to know what was happening beneath the surface. The water line below was doing exactly what it was designed to do, distributing pressure across the land during peak heat, except now it was pushing against a layer that had been added without reinforcement, without clearance, without awareness, and that pressure had nowhere clean to go, so it was finding the weakest path upward. I stopped near the midpoint and looked down, noticing a faint hairline separation forming where two poured sections met, a detail so small most people would miss it entirely. But it was there, and it would not stay small for long. Behind me, Brenda's voice rose again, sharper now. What do you mean shut it down? "We cannot just tear this out," she said, and I could hear the answer. Even without the phone, because there was no simple fix for something like this once it had been set. You do not patch a foundation problem. You remove it or you watch it fail. And I turned back toward her just as she ended the call, her expression no longer confident, no longer controlled, just calculating, trying to find a way out that did not exist. "They are saying we might need to redo sections," she said, almost like she was testing the words, and I tilted my head slightly. "Sections?" I repeated, letting the word hang there, because we both knew this was not going to be limited to a few small areas, not with the way the path had been laid across that line, not with the way the land was already responding. She crossed her arms again, but this time it was not confidence, it was defense. "We will handle it," she said, and I nodded once. "I am sure you will," I replied, because handling it was about to mean something very different than what she had planned, and right then, as if the land wanted to underline the point, a small section near the lowest dip shifted again, just enough to create a visible unevenness along the surface, not a collapse, not anything dramatic, just a quiet, undeniable sign that the process had moved from invisible to visible, and she saw it. She could not ignore it anymore, her eyes locking onto that subtle change, and in that moment the reality finally caught up to her, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was no longer a simple project, no longer a community improvement. This was a problem that was going to grow, cost by cost, day by day, until it reached a scale none of them had prepared for, and I stood there, hands resting loosely at my sides, listening to the faint movement of water beneath the ground and the distant rustle of my cattle shifting farther away, knowing that everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, and that the real consequences had not even begun yet. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted into that harsh angle that makes every imperfection stand out, and what had started as a faint discoloration along the edge of the path was now impossible to ignore. Dark streaks ran unevenly across multiple sections, thin at first, and then widening in places where the ground beneath had softened more aggressively, and I could hear it now too. A subtle change in sound when I stepped onto the concrete, a hollow note that did not belong, like tapping on something that was no longer fully supported. Brenda stood a few yards away on her phone again, pacing tighter circles this time, her voice no longer controlled, but edged with urgency as she repeated phrases like structural integrity and liability exposure, and each time she paused to listen, her expression tightened further, as if every answer she received only made the situation worse. I leaned against the hood of my truck and watched the line of the path stretch across my pasture, following it all the way to where it curved near the creek, and even from this distance I could see slight variations in elevation, barely an inch in some spots, but enough to create a ripple effect across the surface, something that would only grow as the system below continued to do its job. Another notification buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked it, the numbers confirmed what I already knew. Flow had increased again to meet peak demand. Steady, consistent, exactly as designed, and that consistency was the problem, because it meant this was not a one-time event. This was a repeating cycle that would push against that path day after day until something gave way entirely. I walked slowly along the edge, my boots pressing into soil that now held a faint imprint with each step, and I crouched down near one of the darker sections, brushing my fingers against the surface where moisture had started to bead in small, uneven patches, not pooling, not flooding, just enough to indicate that pressure was building beneath a layer that had no business being there. Behind me, I heard Brenda end another call, sharper this time. "Then send someone out here now," she snapped, and when she turned toward me again, the confidence she had carried that morning was gone completely, replaced by calculation and something close to concern. "They are saying if the base is compromised, we might have to remove the entire stretch," she said, and I nodded once, because that was the only logical conclusion. "You built over an active distribution line," I replied, and she shook her head immediately. "That was not on any map," she insisted, and I let out a quiet breath. "That is because it is not public infrastructure," I said, and that was the first time she hesitated in a way that felt different, not confusion, not denial, but realization starting to form around something bigger than a construction error. She glanced toward the creek, then back at the path, then at me. "If it is not public, then whose is it?" she asked, and I held her gaze for a second before answering. Mine, I said simply, and the words seemed to land heavier than anything else that had happened so far. She blinked, processing, trying to connect that answer with everything she thought she understood about this land, about permits, about authority. That is not possible, she said. But her voice lacked the certainty it had before. I reached into my truck again and pulled out a different folder this time. Thicker, organized, filled with documents that were not stamped for show but enforced by contract, long-term agreements, water rights, infrastructure ownership tied directly to this property and extended through private easements that predated her HOA by decades. I opened it just enough for her to see the header, the signatures, the scope. Every gallon that moves under this ground is regulated through this system, I said, tapping the page lightly. And anything built over it without compliance is considered interference. She stared at the documents, then back at the path, and I could see the shift happening in her mind. Not just a project going wrong, but a boundary she had crossed without understanding the consequences. So what does that mean? She asked, quieter now, and I closed the folder slowly, letting the moment settle. It means this is no longer just a construction issue, I said, and as if to underline the point, a faint, audible crack echoed from somewhere along the path, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to draw both our eyes toward the same section where a thin line had finally opened along the surface. Small, but undeniable, and in that instant the situation moved from something they could manage internally to something that would demand outside attention, reports, assessments, legal reviews, costs that would escalate with every hour this remained unresolved. I looked out over the pasture one more time, at the cattle keeping their distance, at the path that was already beginning to fail in slow, methodical ways. And I knew that what started as a complaint about smell and aesthetics had now crossed into a territory where the numbers would no longer be small, and the control they thought they had was already slipping beyond their reach. The first official truck did not arrive until just before sunset, white with a county seal on the door, tires crunching slowly over the gravel like it already knew it was too late to keep this contained. And I could see Brenda standing near the path waiting for them, arms crossed tight, posture rigid, the kind of stance people use when they are trying to hold on to control that is already gone. The air had cooled slightly, but the ground had not. Heat still radiating off the concrete in waves that distorted the edges of everything. And as the inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand, his eyes went straight to the surface before he even spoke. He did not need an introduction. He did not need an explanation. He just walked forward, crouched down near one of the darker sections, and ran his fingers along the same damp edge I had noticed hours earlier, pressing lightly, testing, listening. And when he stood back up, his expression said everything Brenda did not want to hear. How long has this been here? He asked, and she answered quickly too. Quickly. It was completed this morning. And he paused for a second, looking out across the entire stretch, following the subtle waves, the uneven lines, the small but growing separation points that were now visible in multiple sections. This should not be happening this fast, he said, and I could hear the weight behind it. Not confusion, but confirmation, like he had already reached a conclusion and was just walking through the steps to document it. Brenda gestured toward me immediately. He is claiming there is some kind of private line underneath, she said, her tone sharp again, trying to redirect responsibility, and the inspector turned his attention to me. Neutral, professional. Is that accurate? He asked, and I nodded once, reaching into my truck and handing over the same folder, the one that carried decades of agreements and infrastructure documentation. He flipped through it slowly, methodically, eyes scanning each page, each signature, each mapped section, and I watched the moment it clicked for him, the slight shift in posture, the way his grip on the papers tightened just enough to show recognition. This line runs directly under the entire path, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. And then he looked back at Brenda. Did your contractor request clearance for private infrastructure? He asked, and the silence that followed was louder than anything else that had happened all day. She did not answer immediately, because there was no answer that would fix what had already been done. We followed the approved plans, she said finally, but it sounded weaker now, like a statement that no longer carried any protection. The inspector nodded slowly, closing the folder and handing it back to me. Approved plans do not override private infrastructure rights, he said, and then he stepped back, taking in the full length of the path again. "You are going to need to halt access immediately," he added, his voice firm now, procedural, and Brenda shook her head instinctively. "We have an opening scheduled," she said. But even as she spoke, it was clear that schedule no longer mattered. The inspector did not even respond to that. He just pointed toward one of the sections where the surface had shifted enough to be clearly uneven. "This is already compromised," he said. "And if the base continues to destabilize, the entire structure will fail in segments." He was careful with his words, but the implication was clear. This was not a repair. This was removal, reconstruction, liability, and cost stacking on cost. Brenda looked out across the path again, really looking this time, seeing what she had ignored earlier, the subtle changes that were no longer subtle, the small cracks that were beginning to connect, the moisture that kept spreading no matter how long the sun stayed out. And I could see the realization settle in fully, not just that the project had gone wrong, but that it had crossed into something much larger, something that would not be resolved with a meeting or a statement, something that would require tearing out what had just been built and dealing with the consequences of interfering with a system they did not own. And as the inspector walked back toward his truck to make his report, I stood there quietly, listening to the faint movement beneath the ground, steady, controlled, unchanged by any of this, because the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that was the part no one on that HOA board had ever considered, that some things do not adapt to your plans. They force your plans to collapse around them. And by the time Brenda turned back toward me, her expression no longer carried any trace of authority, just the beginning of understanding. I already knew this was the point where control had fully shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, irreversible one that would echo far beyond this stretch of land. By the next morning, the quiet tension that had settled over the land was replaced with a kind of controlled chaos that never needed raised voices to feel overwhelming, because it showed up in paperwork, in vehicles with official markings, in people who spoke carefully but carried decisions that could not be undone. And I watched from the edge of the pasture as a second set of county trucks arrived along with a private engineering firm, their presence confirming what the inspector had already implied the night before. This was no longer a minor issue that could be smoothed over. It had escalated into a formal investigation of structural failure and unauthorized interference with protected infrastructure. And Brenda was already there again, earlier than anyone else this time, standing near the same section where the surface had first shown signs of stress. But her posture had changed, less rigid, more uncertain, like someone trying to recalibrate in real time as the ground beneath her authority continued to shift. The engineers moved with purpose, setting down instruments, marking sections, documenting every visible imperfection. And it did not take long before one of them waved over the county inspector and pointed to a series of connected stress fractures that had formed overnight, subtle but undeniable, running in a line that mirrored exactly where the underground system flowed. And I could see the moment they all understood the scale. Because it was no longer about one weak section, it was systemic. The entire path had been built directly over something that could not support it, and never would. And when they began discussing load distribution and subsurface pressure changes, Brenda tried to step in again, her voice measured but strained, asking how quickly it could be repaired, and one of the engineers answered without hesitation. "It cannot be repaired in place," he said. "It has to be removed," and that single sentence seemed to settle everything, not with drama, but with finality, because removal meant cost, not just the original construction, but demolition, restoration, compliance penalties, legal exposure, and every one of those numbers would multiply as the reports became official. I stayed where I was, not interfering, not interrupting, because this was the part that did not require me to say anything. The system was revealing itself on its own terms now, and the documentation I had provided was being matched against reality piece by piece. And as they continued their assessment, another vehicle pulled up, this one unmarked but familiar to me. And when the man stepped out, I recognized him immediately. Daniel Pierce, lead counsel for the infrastructure group that managed the line beneath my land. A man who did not show up unless the situation had already crossed into significant territory. He greeted me briefly with a nod before walking straight toward the inspection group. Introducing himself, and handing over a separate set of documents that carried far more weight than anything Brenda had presented the day before. Easement rights, operational authority, liability clauses that had been in place long before the HOA ever existed, and I watched as the inspector reviewed them, comparing notes, aligning timelines, and then turning back toward Brenda with a look that was no longer neutral, but official. "You authorized construction over a protected active system without clearance," he said, and she tried to respond, to explain that they had followed community plans, that they believed the land was clear. But the words did not carry anymore, because belief does not override recorded agreements, and Daniel stepped in calmly, his tone even. "The system beneath this land supplies multiple contracted operations across the county," he said. "Any disruption or risk imposed on it triggers immediate legal and financial response." And he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The meaning was already clear. This was no longer about a walking path. It was about liability on a scale that reached far beyond a neighborhood. Brenda looked between them, trying to hold on to something. Any form of control, but it was slipping with every passing minute. And when the inspector informed her that the area would be officially closed pending full removal and investigation, she did not argue this time. She just stood there, absorbing it. And as the engineers began marking the path for demolition zones, placing flags along the entire stretch, I could see neighbors gathering at a distance, watching, whispering, realizing that what had been presented as a simple improvement had turned into something else entirely, something that would not just disappear. And as Daniel returned to my side, quietly confirming that formal notices would be issued within the hour, I took one last look across. The path, now marked, segmented, already treated as something that would soon be gone, and I understood that the shift had fully completed, not just in authority, but in consequence, because the same decision that had been made so casually days ago was now expanding outward, touching contracts, legal frameworks, and financial systems that operated on a scale Brenda had never considered. And there was no path forward for her that did not pass through that reality. The formal notice arrived before noon, delivered both digitally and in person, the kind of redundancy that signals importance rather than efficiency. And by that point, the site had already been transformed from a neighborhood project into an active case, with barriers set up along the entire stretch of the path, warning signs posted at every entry point, and a steady flow of officials moving in and out with the quiet urgency of people documenting something that would be referenced for years. And I stood back from it all, not removed, but no longer central to the unfolding, because the process had moved into a system far larger than any single voice. And Brenda was there again. Though this time she was not standing at the center, she was off to the side with two other members of the board, all of them holding copies of the same document, reading lines that became heavier with each sentence, outlining immediate cessation of use, mandatory removal of the structure, full restoration of the underlying land, and an initial assessment of liability that extended well beyond construction costs into operational risk, contractual disruption, and potential penalties tied to interference with a protected active system. And even from a distance, I could see the moment the numbers started to register, not as abstract figures, but as real consequences, the kind that reshape budgets, dissolve reserves, and trigger legal obligations that cannot be deferred. Daniel stood nearby speaking with the inspector and one of the engineers, his tone steady as he outlined the next steps. Formal claims would be filed, timelines would be enforced, and every phase of the removal would be monitored to ensure no further risk was introduced. And when Brenda finally approached him, her voice was controlled but unmistakably strained, asking if there was any alternative, any way to mitigate what was coming. He listened without interruption before answering in the same calm manner he had maintained from the beginning. The alternative was clearance before construction, he said, not as criticism but as fact, and there was nothing to argue against in that statement, because it pointed back to the moment everything could have been different. And as the conversation ended, she turned slightly, her gaze drifting across the pasture, the path, the markers, the vehicles, taking in the full scope of what had been set in motion. And I could see that the realization had shifted again, deeper now, no longer focused on the immediate problem, but on the chain of decisions that had led here, the small dismissal, the assumption of authority, the refusal to pause, each one stacking quietly until the outcome became unavoidable. And as the first demolition crew began to arrive, their equipment positioned carefully along the designated zones, the transformation became physical, not just documented, sections of the path marked for removal, schedules posted, oversight established, the beginning of a process that would reverse everything that had been built only days before. And yet even that reversal would not erase the consequences already in motion, because contracts had been triggered, reports filed, and responsibilities assigned. And as I watched the first segment being prepared for removal, not with force but with precision, I felt no need to step forward, no need to explain or emphasize anything further, because the scale of the response had already done that on its own. And when Daniel returned to me one last time, confirming that the initial claim had been submitted and that further notices would follow, I simply nodded, understanding that what had started as a small, seemingly insignificant decision had expanded exactly as systems like this always do, outward, upward, into layers that do not bend to intention, only to fact. And as the sun began to lower again, casting long shadows across the now segmented path, the same land that had been treated as empty space revealed its true nature, not through argument, but through consequence. And the shift that had begun quietly days ago had reached its final form, complete, irreversible, and far larger than anyone on that board had ever imagined when they first decided to draw a line across it.